7 teams remain undefeated as the meat of the non-conference slate comes to a close. We discuss who among them are contenders and who among them are just pretending.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. All right, Leif Tulane and I are here today to talk about the 7 remaining undefeated teams in college basketball, whether these teams have legitimate chances of winning the national championship or at least winning their conference, what this might look like, which of these teams have earned their undefeated status, which teams are maybe kind of flying by the seat of their pants. Leif, before we get into diving into these 7 teams, I do want to talk about the big news out of the transfer portal, because we're almost never not talking about the transfer portal in this modern era. Nae'Qwan Tomlin leaves Kansas State, a very messy situation there without all the details. We're not going to dive too far into that necessarily, but he enters the transfer portal. Reports at this point indicate that he should be eligible starting in the spring semester after graduating, and he will join the Memphis Tigers, Penny Hardaway's team, who, of course, looks like they're going to be without Jordan Brown for the rest of the season. At least that is the most updated report. A team that hopes to have 27-year-old DeAndre Williams in the front court. That did not happen for them, so now they go out at a 6'10" player in Tomlin, who's very good defensively, tons of length, tons of athleticism, doesn't exactly space the floor maybe in the way that Memphis would like him to do, but perhaps he can find that outside shot. What do you think about this addition for a Memphis team that's kind of been right on the edge of being a top 25 team and certainly is going to be a contender in the AAC alongside FAU?
Well, I mean, if he's able to play and he contributes, he should be very, very good for this team because, like you said, he's excellent defensively, brings versatility, can play with the ball a little bit. I'm not saying he'll be a ball handler, but he brings the ability to put the ball on the floor and create a defensive, like when there's a defensive breakdown, he creates havoc because he can bring the ball on the floor and then pass or score. Yeah. And he's 6'10" and all of it. So defensively, Memphis is kind of a havoc type of team. They like to get in your grill, force turnovers. Well, that plays right into what Nae'Qwan Tomlin does very well. He can also clean up on the backside and block shots. Now the question is, how much of a learning curve will there be? Because Memphis in AAC play probably can get away with it, but they play a couple games soon that I feel like really dictate how good they can actually be in the non-conference and he won't play those. But now if they get going and play really well, does that influence his role a little bit, I guess, is the question I have, because David Jones is playing very well, and they're already a pretty veteran-laden team, even without DeAndre Williams. I mean, if they had DeAndre Williams, Nae'Qwan Tomlin, David Jones, Javon Kinnerly, that's older than half the NBA teams. And I'm curious to see exactly what happens with his role, because on paper, he's an excellent fit. Just like he would have been at Kansas State, and that was a large reason I banked on Kansas State being very good this year. Was Nae'Qwan Tomlin.
Well, Clemson is Memphis's next upcoming opponent, and we're going to talk about them as one of these 7 undefeated teams. We are going to start, though, with Tommy Lloyd and the Arizona Wildcats, the number 1 ranked team in the country right now in the AP poll, number 1 ranked team for Locked On College Basketball's poll. They are 2nd in KenPom, 5th in adjusted offensive efficiency, 2nd in adjusted defensive efficiency. I didn't actually check this, but I think they're the only team in the top 5 in both. Arizona has some fantastic wins. A lot of the teams in this undefeated conversation have good wins, but Arizona, I mean, Duke, Michigan State, Wisconsin. Wisconsin was at home. Duke was on a true road game for them. Obviously, Michigan State hasn't looked quite as good or not nearly as good, really, as people expected them to be, but that's still an impressive trio of wins, and it's not going to get easier for Tommy Lloyd's team. They got Purdue in Indianapolis on the 16th on Saturday. They follow that up with Alabama and then FAU. Arizona might be the best team in this group. I would pick them personally as the best team in this group. They might also be the first team in this group to lose a game just because Purdue is such a difficult matchup. But Tommy Lloyd's team really balanced, really good starting five. The backcourt has been phenomenal. Obviously, I think the thing that I like about Arizona and the way they constructed their roster is they can, if Caleb Love plays great, which he sometimes does, it elevates the program. If Caleb Love plays like Caleb Love sometimes does, where he has those 2 of 12 shooting nights or whatever it may be, it seems like they're kind of more equipped to handle that. And I think that's why we've seen this team not live and die by Caleb Love the way that some of those old North Carolina teams kind of had to do in the past. What do you make of this Arizona team? Do you feel like this is a team that can Tommy Lloyd break through and win a championship this year? It feels to me like yes.
I think they're the best team in college basketball right now. I think there's a lot that can happen, though. I think it's less about Caleb Love and more about how well Kylan Boswell plays throughout the entire season. Once he's scouted as, hey, this is the point guard. This is a guy who is the point guard of a national championship caliber team, and how that impacts his performance, because he's been very, very good. And I expect him to continue to be very good. Keyshawn Johnson has been the best addition on the transfer portal. Everyone talks about Caleb Love. And honestly, there was more talk about Jaden Bradley from Alabama too. But Keyshawn Johnson's the most important player on Arizona, bar none, in my opinion. He's able to give them a physical body that can play 3 through 5. I know he plays the 4 almost always, but he can play the 5. He can guard on the perimeter almost 1 through 5. He'll hit a few threes, but he's not really a shooter, but he accepts that. And that's something that you don't see the buy-in from teams, to have a guy who said, hey, I started on a national championship runner-up team last year, and now I'm going to take a similar role on a team that has similar aspirations, rather than moving up in the world and saying, hey, I want the ball. I deserve the ball. He's a dirty work guy. And I think he and Kylan Boswell hold the keys. Umar Balo is going to be good. Krivas off the bench is going to produce. And then the guards are going to score. Now the question is, how efficiently can they do it, and how many turnovers will they have? And I think Boswell maintains that. And then the defensive efficiency is Keyshawn Johnson's role. So I'm all in on the Wildcats being a national championship contender. I think there is something to be said that Tommy Lloyd has to prove something, because they lost to Princeton and they lost to a Houston team that was solid, but not one of Kelvin Sampson's better ones. And they had all NBA talents in on that team. So there's a prove it moment, but I think they're very substantially in the national championship contention, and I'd argue the best team in college basketball.
Well, we're certainly going to get to Houston and Baylor and Oklahoma when we do our Big 12 conversation in the second segment. But for now, I want to move on and talk about Clemson, 9-0 coming out of the ACC. Ken Palm has them 25th in the country right now, 27th at offense, 31st on defense. They're ranked much higher than that in the AP poll, much higher than that in our poll as well. Have some very quality wins on the road at Pitt, on the road at Alabama. They also beat TCU on a battle of undefeated teams. They got Memphis next. Again, a Memphis team that is not going to have Nae'Qwan Tomlin yet, and certainly not going to have Jordan Brown. That is a road game for Clemson, a tough one there. But this team has looked really, really good. They're coming off of a good season last year. PJ Hall's back. He's looked incredible. And you talked about Keyshawn Johnson being a great, but maybe somewhat under the radar addition for Arizona. And I feel similarly about Joe Girard, a guy who didn't get a ton of attention as a transfer addition this offseason, but has been absolutely phenomenal for the Tigers.
Yeah, the Clemson has been a team that I would say has improved their stock as much as anyone from the start of the season to where we are right now. Clemson, I think the most optimistic ACC pundit or fan would have picked third probably, and I would say that's the most optimistic. I would say the majority would said 5th or 6th, and I would not be surprised at all if they win the ACC. I've bet on them numerous times, and luckily, because they're undefeated and they've been underdogs a couple times, that's been a very good bet. They can, but what I'm impressed by is not necessarily them just holding off and beating some teams. It's the teams they've beaten play very distinct styles, and they've been able to beat both those teams. TCU tries to force a million turnovers. Early in the game, Clemson gave the ball away, and like they kept it close, but like it was like, oh my gosh, like you can't score. You're turning the ball over against a TCU team that can only score in transition. Like this is a bad sign. They figured it out and were in firm control the rest of the game. Alabama scores they're the number one Ken Palm offense in college basketball. They score like it's breathing, and Clemson was able to slow the game down and score against an inferior Alabama defense and do enough defensively to win that game handily. And I know it ended up being kind of close, but like they were in control the entirety of that game in Tuscaloosa. PJ Hall is a potential All-American. Joe Girard, I like that you mentioned him. Space is the floor. That's something they lack. I think Clemson needs to get one more shooter because the Hunter brothers have been poor from three. Yeah. Ian Shefflin's the guy I want to pick out, though. He's an offensive rebounding machine, gives them extra chances, compliments PJ Hall, doesn't need the ball. And then Godfrey is someone who's a long wing defender who, if he starts hitting threes, that really elevates their ceiling. I think Clemson's probably a Sweet 16 team. And I think they're going to come down to earth a little bit, but I think they can win the ACC. And if they do that, they may be an Elite Eight team. I hesitate to say Final Four just because they're very dependent on PJ Hall.
Yeah. Well, 3 of the 7 undefeated teams in the country remain in the Big 12 Conference. We're going to discuss whether Houston or Baylor are true national championship contenders. We'll also talk about this phenomenal Oklahoma start. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the college basketball offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time than right now to get in on the action. The app is really easy to use. There is a wide range of betting options, which includes spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Right now, Memphis remains at plus 210 to win the AAC. If you feel confident in that Nae'Qwan Tomlin edition for them to potentially take down FAU, then it's time to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get in on the action this college basketball season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, Leaf, let's look ahead to these 3 teams in the Big 12 that remain undefeated. Last weekend, there were 6. BYU, TCU, and Cincinnati were all undefeated to start the season. All 3 fell over the weekend, leaving 3 teams in this really, really stacked Big 12 conference that remain undefeated. We'll start with Houston, the number 1 ranked team at Ken Palm right now. They're also the number 1 ranked defense, although they are down at 18 on offense. I suspect that's going to be the crux of our conversation with the Cougs here. They got wins over Xavier, Utah, and Dayton. Certainly not a murderer's row of victories. I think you could argue that none of those teams will make the NCAA tournament. I also think it's possible that all 3 of those teams make the NCAA tournament. So Houston's a little bit harder to pin down because they haven't played a great schedule. They do have Texas A&M coming up on Saturday. I think that's a huge kind of turning point for how this Houston team season might go as they get into the Big 12 for the first time. LJ Cryer has been an absolutely fantastic addition, provides that much needed scoring punch. But Leaf, is Cryer enough offense for this team to be a legitimate contender, even with that phenomenal defense?
See, that's where the question, like you anticipated, lies, because LJ Cryer at Baylor was on a similar situation where they were excellent offensively, but there were still games where Adam Flagler and Keontae George got hurt, and it was just he and Adam Flagler. And then when he became higher on a scouting report, struggled. He's been excellent so far, but I would argue all the teams that Houston has played are pretty bad defensively. Xavier is atrocious defensively. Delaware went to the Cintas Center and scored a ton of points on them. Utah actually will be a pretty good win. I think they probably are on a bubble team right now and have the chance to improve it. They're all right defensively, but early in the season, they were before the BYU game, were 80th defensively. So I have my questions about how sustainable the offense is. Now, when they played Xavier, I watched all of this game, Houston and Xavier. They were like kind of doing that thing where they stave off someone. It was like the older brother kind of putting a stiff arm on the little brothers running at him, even though it was at Xavier, and Xavier is a proud basketball school, but they just don't have the horses. Houston just didn't score for a matter of 5 minutes on multiple times, and that can't happen. It's like Tennessee. Houston and Tennessee are similar to me. Both of them have the capacity on a given day to beat anyone in the country, and I sincerely believe that. But they have these offensive lulls that concern me. And Tennessee has these dynamic days scoring that make the offensive lulls more apparent because it's like, well, what the heck is this? Houston has them more often, but they play a style that makes it less like, oh, geez, this is horrible. So I'm going to say pretender to win a national championship, but they're absolutely a contender to be like an Elite Eight team. Like I love what Kelvin Sampson does. I always have. And I think he's been one of the more underrated coaches in college basketball, and only recently is getting his flowers. But the team just, like, other than LJ Cryer, who's going to be your second leading scorer? Is it Jamal Shed? Wouldn't you rather it be Terrence Arsenault? But Arsenault has become like a draft prospect to some, but he's scoring very few points per game, and his efficiency is not great. And so, can you get that many rebounds in 6 straight games? That's the question for me.
Switching over to Baylor, kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. Baylor is 7th at Ken Pom right now. They are the 2nd ranked offensive team in the country, but they are all the way down at 42 defensively. This is kind of something we've seen in the Scott Drew era, that they put together some absolutely phenomenal offenses, but haven't quite brought the horses defensively. Their best wins are Auburn and Florida. Those are really their only 2 super standout wins. They have a win over Seton Hall, which is okay, but Seton Hall is not a particularly great team. They do got a chance to beat Michigan State on the road coming up on Saturday. Then they play Duke, so 2 huge games. Again, somewhat similar to Houston of like, hey, we're about to learn a lot more about this team in the next week or so. Jacoby Walter has been phenomenal. The 2nd year in a row that Baylor has brought in a really high-level scoring guard, of course, after Keontae George last year. Ray J. Dennis it took him a little bit of time to kind of find his spot, to transfer out of Toledo, but I think he's been solid as of late for them as well. And then Yves Missy, what a revelation for him. One of the kind of the big pop-up freshman prospects in college basketball, has looked really, really good as a dynamic low post player, a high rim runner, defensive player. But the question for Baylor is the opposite question as we had for Houston. Are they going to be good enough defensively to win a national championship? That's the question.
I don't think so. And then I also don't think their offense is as sustainable as some of these other elite offenses. Not because they don't have the horses, quite the contrary. I think that sometimes when you have too many ball in hand players, there's going to be a game where that one ball in hand guy, namely for this team, Ray J. Dennis, is off, and it influences the ability to score for a guy like Jacoby Walter, who also is a freshman. Typically, when your best players are freshmen, no matter how good they are, it's pretty hard to win if they're a scorer. Like, the only freshman that's been able to do that is Carmelo Anthony. And everyone's going to say, oh, Anthony Davis. No, Anthony Davis's team wasn't relying on his scoring. It was
he was a defensive banker.
Yeah, exactly. And so Brandon Miller was about as good a freshman scorer you've had in years past. They didn't win a championship. And I know this is nitpicking because only a few teams have won championships.
Right.
But Jacoby Walter won't have the ball enough. And if Ray J. Dennis has it and he does his little post-up game, I just don't think it's a sustainable way to score for that many games. So they'll be able to score, but I don't think they'll be able to score and defend well enough to win a couple. I kind of think they're a Sweet 16 team. I'm a little lower on Baylor. I think they're pretty fraudulent in terms of where they're ranked. I enjoy watching them. They play pretty basketball in the sense that Jacoby Walter's a really good guy to watch for the draft. They shoot the ball well. Yves Missy is someone I'm pretty high on for the draft as well. But I just don't see them raising any banners in the Big 12 or in a national championship sense of. And I think conference play will really open eyes. And I know the next one's Oklahoma, and I'd be curious to see your take. Which team's better? Everyone would say conventional wisdom points at Baylor. Oklahoma seems a little more sustainable to me, but I still have questions.
Yeah, let's talk about Oklahoma. They're 19th at Ken Pom right now, so there's only a 12-spot difference between them and Baylor. The rankings have them also in similar spots, as well as Oklahoma has kind of jumped up in the AP poll and in our poll. I got to tell you, Leaf, I didn't think we'd be having a conversation about Baylor or Oklahoma this season, but that is the spot that we are out. Shout out to Porter Mosier. This team is 36th in offensive efficiency at Ken Pom, 12th in defensive efficiency. They have some really quality wins: Arkansas, Providence, USC, and Iowa. Now, Arkansas and USC are wins that certainly looked better in November than they look now, unfortunately. But Providence has been very solid. And really, the main thing for me that I like about Oklahoma is they're not playing any close games. They've won 7 of their 9 games by double digits. One of them was Arkansas, who they only beat by 9. But for anybody who watched that game, it never felt like it was particularly close. And they had a 2-point victory over USC. But other than that, they've basically been blowing everybody out there. Their next game is Green Bay, so that should be a W for them. But then they got North Carolina in Charlotte on the 20th. That's a huge game for the Sooners. I love what Porter Moser's doing. I probably personally would still take Baylor just because I think the offense is dynamic enough that they can outscore a team like Oklahoma, even with Oklahoma's good defense. But certainly I wouldn't be surprised if they split the regular season series and if Oklahoma is kind of right with them throughout the year.
I think I agree that Baylor's better, and I think their talent is significantly better, but I think Porter Moser is such a good coach. He will milk out every last ounce of talent that he has. The one question I have for Baylor is Javion McCollum has been awesome. When's the last time a very slight of build guard has sustained the ability to score in the Big 12? And it might be another guy from Norman and Trae Young.
Yeah.
But Javion McCollum's not Trae Young. Trae Young was a top 5 recruit. He was a top 5 draft pick. And I've been trying to rack my brains. Like, there's been diminutive guards that have done well, but they've been stocky, like Frank Mason, obviously Marquise Noel last year. I just think there's going to be the physicality of the Big 12 play is going to make him less consistent, and that's my concern. I think defensively, Oklahoma's going to be good. I think they're going to get enough out of Milos Uzon. I think you get enough out of Otega Away. You get enough out of the surrounding cast, some of those bigger bodies on the interior. They're going to get rebounds with Ugly. I like a lot of what they do. I just wonder if he becomes less efficient and then how that impacts a team. And then the thing about Baylor versus Oklahoma is at a certain point, firepower matters a lot. And that's why I would still slightly favor Baylor. But I think Oklahoma's got a more true identity. Like, they know what they are. What is Baylor right now? Baylor is a team that can score, but do they have like an offense that they score through? No, it's just they kind of play basketball. Yeah. And I know Scott Drew can coach. There's no slight at him, but I feel like Porter Moser's instilled like this is who we are. This is how we're going to win. And it's visible while watching on a TV screen. Like, it would be more visible in person, but like it's impressive when you can see it on a TV screen and be like, wow, this team was not good last year. They've become more athletic and they play really hard and they play together. Whereas Baylor feels to me like an amalgamation of talent.
We're going to close out the show discussing 2 more undefeated teams this season, including this year's mid-major darling in James Madison, as well as Chris Beard's early winning streak at Ole Miss. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best and most qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. It's super easy to create a free job post, and then all you do is add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. From there, simple tools like screening questions can make it easy to focus on candidates who have just the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Leaf, rounding it out, 2 more undefeated teams here. Let's start in the SEC, the only undefeated team sitting in that conference, Ole Miss, as we all expected, of course. Ken Pom does not love what we've seen from the Rebels so far this year, has them all the way down at 91. That is 20 spots lower than James Madison, well below every other one of the undefeated teams. Ken Pom has them 88th in offensive efficiency, 107th in defensive efficiency, and they have some solid wins. Memphis, NC State, South Florida, nothing too terrible, or excuse me, Central Florida, nothing too terrible in there. But the issue really is that they're barely beating teams. I mean, they have just snuck by, and Chris Beard even acknowledged it in a recent interview that like they're lucky they haven't been bit yet by how many close games they've played. 1-point win over Detroit Mercy, 1-point win at Temple, 2-point win over Central Florida, 3-point wins over Sam Houston State and Memphis. Basically, every game has been tight. You like that in terms of getting experience and familiarity playing in close games. I think that is valuable for teams that, you know, at this point, Ole Miss is absolutely gunning for an at-large, you know, to be in that at-large conversation. And you want to be able to win those close games. They've proven it, but that combined with a relatively weak strength of schedule kind of has this team looking a little bit less like what you'd expect to see from a 9-0 roster at this point in the season. But, you know, they might stay undefeated through the rest of the non-conference slate because they have Cal, and then they have, I think they have Troy, Southern Miss, and Bryant. And then their first conference game is at Tennessee. Hard to imagine they win that one. If they do, certainly our conversation about Ole Miss might have to change. But, you know, I don't want to knock a team for being undefeated at this point in the season because that's not easy to do. But Ole Miss certainly hasn't made it look easy to get here at this point.
I've actually liked what I've seen from Ole Miss.
Mhm.
Honestly, I haven't watched them play some of those lesser teams, but
Sure.
I watched them play Memphis.
Mhm.
I thought Memphis was going to win that game. Memphis was probably the better team for 30 of the 40 minutes, and then Ole Miss in the final 10 minutes executed better, played harder. Granted, they were at home,
Mhm.
and they pulled that win out. I would say that their wins more recently have been more definitive than their narrow wins early in the season against inferior teams, and that's good.
Yeah.
It shows, yes, you can pull out games when don't have your A game, but also you can rise up to the occasion. I mean, I think Chris Beard is a person that may be less than something you want to commend, but his coaching skills are
Yeah.
undeniable. He went to Little Rock, took him to the tournament, beat Purdue. Goes to Texas Tech, goes to the national championship. Goes
Mhm.
to Texas, does very well. I have a lot of faith in Ole Miss. I actually was higher on them entering this season than many. I think I did an SEC projection, and I had them making the tournament, which
Mhm.
doesn't sound crazy, like, oh, Ole Miss makes the tournament, whatever. But if you were to look at the SEC and were to choose 7, 8 teams, I don't think many people would have taken Ole Miss. And that was a leap of faith on roster and Chris Beard in particular. I don't think they're a contender to win a national championship. I
Mhm.
don't think they're going to win the SEC.
Mhm.
But I do think they could be a top 5 team in the SEC, and
Yeah.
that was even higher than what I had them at. I think I had them 7th in the SEC,
Mhm.
and the 7th to 5th in the SEC is quite a leap, actually. Like if you were to
Yeah.
look at the tiers of teams, that's something. I think they'll be a team that they win most of their games at home. They're going to pick off a team like Alabama on the road. I'm not
Mhm.
saying it will be Alabama, but someone of that quality in
Right.
Alabama, of Florida. I don't think they'll get Tennessee on the road, but who knows?
Mhm.
I think they're going to be a team that has enough wins that you can't keep them out of the dance, and I certainly wouldn't want to play in the first or second round.
Worth acknowledging too that they only recently got Musa Cisse eligible, and they're still waiting on Brandon Murray. I don't think he'll get eligibility, but you never know. That has been something we've seen a few times this year. Also, want to shout out Alan Flanagan, transfer from Auburn, who's having a phenomenal season for the Rebels. 18 points, 7 boards, 2.5 assists, just under 2 steals, over a block, shooting 43%. Literally doing a little bit of everything for this team. It's been nice to see him have that success after a kind of up and down career at Auburn. But Leaf, I do want to move on to the final team on our list, the mid-major darling of the season. Every year there's an FAU, a Charleston, going back Wichita State, like those kind of teams that just kind of continue to win. And James Madison got their big wins out of the way real early. They beat Michigan State in the first game of the season, a big stunner there. They beat Kent State in double overtime in their second game of the season. And at that point, my co-host Isaac Shade started to identify like, hey, they don't really have any games for a long time that might trip them up. And here they are 7 wins later, still undefeated. KenPom has them 71st. Obviously strength of schedule is a factor there. 44th on offense, 125th on defense. Certainly not something you love to see there. Their next game is at Hampton. And again, they don't have a team ranked currently inside the top 150 at KenPom on their schedule until January 13th, when they take on Appalachian State at home. In fact, they are given 65% or higher odds to win every single one of their games except their road game against App State, which is, I think, in late January. This is a team that might legitimately go. I think they're the favorite to be undefeated the longest. Certainly, strength of schedule plays a factor in there. I think talent-wise, they are probably the worst team on here. Not that is a slight to them necessarily. This is a really fun team. I really like watching them play. Terrence Edwards, TJ Bickerstaff are awesome. The team averages 94 points per game. They shoot 39% from 3. They space you out. They shoot the crap out of the ball. They don't play a lot of defense, which makes them more fun to watch, but certainly is going to be something that trips them up. Comparing them to those Charleston teams, that FAU team last year, is this team on that caliber? Are they more of a flash in the pan? What's kind of your read on James Madison at this point?
It's hard to say because, like you said, other than the Michigan State win, that
Mhm.
they haven't really wowed you. Kent State's
Yeah.
a good basketball team,
Yeah.
but they're not as good as they have been in years past.
Correct.
I watched them play a couple other games. They eked out a few wins.
Mhm.
I mean, my take is really, so I watched them play Southern Illinois, and I watched that entirety, and I was sweating that bet. I had a 5.5 point spread, and they won
Mhm.
by 6. So James Madison, I'm a big fan of you for that. But here's the thing: they have a guy in Edwards that can do a lot of things, and
Mhm.
most mid-major teams that have this like, hey, we believe in them. They have a guy that that they go to. They do. They also have Bickerstaff, who I would say is just about as good a Robin as there is in a top 20 team. That's not one of the ones we say can cut down the nets.
Right.
And so I believe in their capacity to win a game in the tournament. The issue is if you don't defend against some of these high major teams, and Michigan State went like 1 of 30 from 3 in that game. And it was still an overtime game. Yeah. So I think there's a little bit more of a flukiness as opposed to FAU. And I'll admit I was late on FAU last year. I saw them and I was like, whatever. Like what? And then you watch them play this year, and obviously you know what they are, and you watched them play in the tournament and everything. You say, wow, this team's a well-oiled machine. And I don't quite feel that way with James Madison. I think they're a well-oiled machine offensively, but defensively, they're like a sieve against inferior opponents, but they just know they can outscore. That doesn't work against bigger teams. That said, if you can score enough against bigger teams, they feel some scoreboard pressure and anything can happen. I just don't think they're quite the FAU Cinderella type. I think they could win a round, maybe 2, but I would say that's a bit dubious.
Yeah, I would love for them to get, like, instead of getting on that 8-9 like FAU did last year, I'd love for them to get like an 11 or even a 12, where whatever 5 or 6 seed draws them is going to just be sweating all week long leading up to that game, because they could, if they get an 11 seed, I think they could definitely beat whatever 6 seed, and I think there's a chance they could beat a 3 seed depending on the matchup, of course. But this is a fun team that, I don't think they're Final Four, but I wouldn't have predicted FAU in the Final Four at this time last year either. So I guess you never really know, but James Madison, you can see the reasons that they're maybe not as highly regarded, but boy, they are fun to watch. That's for sure. Leaf, that's going to do it for us today. Thank you so much, man, for coming on the show. As always, love these Wednesday episodes. I thought this was a great opportunity to talk about these undefeated squads and kind of where we're at with them leading into what should be a fun weekend of college basketball with all of these teams in action against some quality opponents. We'll be back on Thursday. Isaac and I will be to preview this big weekend slate of games, back on Friday as well with a fun interview with the head coach. All that coming up here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. And until tomorrow, peace.